Hello, welcome. My name is Yi-Ting Shen. I am MBA class of 2007. Today I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Suri, right here. You'll hear very exciting topics that she will give. I will just wanted to do a brief introduction about Professor Suri's background. Professor Suri is the Maurice F. Strong Career Development Professor and an Associate Professor of Applied Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Suri is a development economist with a regional focus on Sub-Saharan Africa. Her research centers on agriculture, household financial access, and informal risk sharing, and more recently, governance and political participation. A large body of her work focuses on constraints to technology adoption in agriculture. She also conducted a lot of research on the impacts of mobile money and the application of the mobile money platform for credit contracts. Her recent work has focused on governance issues in Kibra slum in Nairobi and a large-scale field experiment she conducted in Kenya during the 2013 general election. She spends a lot of time in the field, collecting her own data, primarily in Kenya, Sierra Leone, and Rwanda. Professor Suri holds a BA in economics from Trinity College, Cambridge University, as well as an MA in international and development economics, and an MPhil in economics and a PhD from Yale University. Please join me in welcoming Professor Suri.
Thanks for the very kind welcome and introduction, Yi-Ting. I hope you guys are all having a great time being back at MIT campus. I will say I didn't expect to see so many familiar faces because I didn't feel like I'd been teaching that long, but apparently I have. So people I recognize, welcome back to MIT. I hope you're having a good weekend and a good reunion, I guess, and a good centennial. So this is probably, I don't know, your 10th colloquium of the day, so I apologize for being the last of the day in some way. Hopefully, I'm going to spend the next hour or so, hour and a bit, talking about mobile technology and voting in Sub-Saharan Africa. And this is based on joint work with two PhD students at MIT, Ben Marks and Vincent Pons. Actually, Ben is in the audience. So if you have hard questions, direct them to Ben. The easy ones, send my way. OK, so we got it. OK, so a bunch of us have started thinking about how you strengthen the voices of the poor in developing countries. Okay, after Martin Sen's sort of book is Democracy as Freedom, where he thinks about the ability to vote as a fundamental, or the ability to participate as a fundamental right, this question is sort of becoming very important in developing countries. And partly because there's been a paradigm shift in development economics. There was a pretty heavy top-down approach during the 90s, right? A lot of international development and international organizations thought, OK, we know what is good for you, and we're going to go do it, OK? And it was a very, very top-down approach, and that has largely been unsuccessful, OK? You haven't really solved global poverty in any real way, and if anything, it's getting worse or deeper, OK? And so there's been a shift after the sort of large failure of top-down approaches of the Washington Consensus towards thinking about how do we create development from the bottom up, okay? And what sorts of approaches would work from the bottom up, okay? And so the biggest new approach, or the biggest new insight, is to let the poor decide for themselves in some way. Okay, what does that mean? Let's try to improve provision of public goods, and let's try to improve civil rights, civic society participation, political participation on the poor, and then they can decide what they want. Okay, and hopefully that will lead to a better system than just sort of top-down deciding what's best. Okay, so how do we give a voice to the poor in societies that largely don't have established systems of representative democracy? Okay, for a lot of these countries, you'll see, they've had democracy for 10 or 20 years. This is not a particularly long experience. Okay, and often it's not truly a democracy, right? There's a lot of violence that has been associated with various elections, et cetera, et cetera. And so how do you try to create better systems of democracy and give people the certainty of having a voice in these systems? Okay, so democracy has increased dramatically since the 1970s. That seems to be a pretty evident fact across the world. And 63 countries since then have experienced some version of a permanent transition to democracy. I guess permanent's not great because it's only been 30 years, but okay. But along with democracy, you don't get full accountability. Okay, so even though you call a lot of these countries democracies, you still have corrupt politicians in power, right? In India, at some point, there were people who were in jail running for office. Not sure that counts as a great politician. Social services is poor quality, and there's no accountability, right? There's schools, but teachers don't show up to school, and there's no way to ensure that they show up to school. If they don't show up to school, you may as well not have had a school to start with. Okay, and there's little discussion of policies, right? When you think of campaigns in developing countries, it's not about, I want to do X, Y, Z as a policy. It's much more about, corralling in other ways. Okay, I want people to vote for me, and not really thinking about how do I create a policy platform. Okay, so what's the solution to this? And largely the solution so far has been promoting participatory democracy under the umbrella of these community-driven development programs. Okay, what did these do? What they do is they say, okay, we're not going to even decide what public goods you need. I'm going to go to a community and say, you know what, I was going to spend $10,000 on a road. Instead of spending $10,000 on a road, I'm going to say, here's $10,000. Why don't you as a community decide what you want to do? Okay? And so these have been implemented, and not only do they require participation, but they're going to say, okay, but we want to make sure women are participating. We want to make sure other marginalized groups, either castes in India or whatever you want to think of this, we're going to make sure that they're all participating, right? So a lot of the focus has been on women and youth. How do we make sure that they're actually able to participate in this decision, and it's not a bunch of elders just deciding what to do? Okay, so the idea is this would transform authoritarian regimes a little, because it would give people control and people a voice. It would lead to better public goods, because surely these people know what's better for them. Maybe a road isn't what they need, but they need something else. Okay? Something like 9% of the World Bank's total lending goes to CDD projects. Okay? Accompanying this in the last probably 3 years, there's been a bunch of very, very rigorous evaluations, and I'll talk about what I mean by a rigorous evaluation in a bit, in 4 countries, in Sierra Leone, Liberia, DRC, and Afghanistan. I'll show you a picture from the Sierra Leone one. Here's the meeting to decide, okay? So they called people up to this meeting and said, okay, here's the amount of money you're going to spend. What would you like, right? And you can see there's a bunch of reasonably young people and a bunch of women. Okay, so they're trying to improve women and young people's participation in these decisions. Okay, and what these rigorous evaluations have found is basically they don't do anything. Okay, largely you're not changing anything about how people participate and what the decisions made are. Okay? Even if people have a voice, they're often picking what the village leader would have wanted, which they know. Okay? And so it doesn't matter that you're trying to do this, because it largely has no effects. So in Sierra Leone, the study finds there's no evidence for sustained impacts on collective action, on decision making, or the involvement of marginalized groups. Okay? So for that day, yes, I got women and kids to show up because I wouldn't hold the meeting until they showed up. The next time you did anything else, did they show up? No. Okay, so they'll show up for the case where you force them to show up, but then when I try to replicate that, it's not going to replicate with them showing up. Okay? So it's not an effective agent of institutional and social change. It didn't specifically empower women and youth in the local development process. Okay, now we found this in several cases and in several countries. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is a pretty large one, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and Afghanistan. Okay, so clearly CDD is a great way to spend money. If you want to spend dollars, definitely a good way to spend money. Very expensive to do, okay, because you're going to truck out with lots of money to all sorts of different places and then run this process and then decide what to build, okay? But it's not effective in accomplishing that agenda of getting the poor to participate more in what their lives look like, okay? So what does that do? Are we back to square one? One hypothesis is that maybe you can work on improving the function of the democracy itself. Okay, democracies exist. They're just not very well fleshed out in institutions, okay? And the processes aren't great. So how can you get people to participate more in these processes and improve that efficiency? It is already a process by which people participate. Can we give them more information that would affect their decisions? Can we give them information that would make them more likely to participate, okay? And this might be a better and potentially cheaper way to give the poor a voice. Okay? So Democratic participation is actually a challenge everywhere, much as I talk about poor countries, right? It is a challenge in the US and it's a challenge in Europe, right? Turnout rates are quite low. And it's true for marginalized and disadvantaged people, okay? Even in the US. So here's turnout by income. In the US 2008 presidential election, you can see that the turnout of rich people, over $150,000, is about double that of extremely poor people, okay? So having marginalized groups vote less or participate less in elections is not actually just a function of poor countries. And I'll show you one more, which is by education. And you'll see it's even more striking. Okay, so only 23% of the people with less than 9th grade education will ever participate or did participate in the 2008 election. And people with advanced degree, it's up at 80%. Okay, so this is seriously not a problem only in developing countries. Okay, but developing countries come with additional challenges, right? They don't have just low participation from some groups, but they also have to establish credible democracies at the same time. And they're in the process of trying to do that, right? They have new institutions, but these institutions are competing with traditional governance, right? If you think of the CDD case, I tried to set up this whole new institution. The problem is there's a traditional way to allocate resources that exists. And you're trying to move them so far away from this that it just doesn't work, okay? And so you have to think about how these new established institutions are competing with what was already there, okay? And these challenges are more acute in countries that have mixed experiences with democracy. Okay, and I'm going to show you that as we go along. Okay, I'll skip the academic literature because you really don't want to know about it in general, okay? But I'm happy to give you a brief view. It's just a lot of people have found that if you go out and try to motivate people to vote, it works, okay? And it works more for marginalized groups, like in France and the US. Okay, so today, what are the questions I want to talk about? Okay, I'm going to talk about how do you try to build new democratic institutions, okay? Or how do you try to strengthen democratic institutions that people are trying to build, okay? Now, setting up institutions will ultimately be the easy part of the problem, okay? The hard part of the problem is how do you create credibility in them, right? It's not about per se the institution itself. It's about how do people feel about those institutions? Do they have trust in these institutions, okay? And so I'm going to show you an example of a study of mine where we start to think about newly established institutions around democracy in Kenya, which has a pretty short history of multi-party democracy, and decided to pass a new constitution in 2010 with a completely different set of political institutions, okay? The election before this, in 2007, if anybody remembers, was very, very contested, led to a lot of violence over the space of about 4 months, you know, more than 600,000 people displaced, several thousand killed. Okay, and this is largely symptomatic of a lot of elections. People worry, right? One thing we keep track of is like, okay, how many elections in Africa this year? And which ones do we think are going to be okay or not? Okay, so they put in a whole bunch of institutions, but how do you actually convince people that these institutions are working or functioning? Okay, or can you even do that? Okay, so can policy consolidate the impact of this change in institutions? Okay, those are the questions we're going to be asking. Okay. So what is our contribution here? Our contribution is going to be using a field experiment. I'll describe what this is in a minute. And using text messages to basically wholesale distribute information to people about these new institutions, okay, in Kenya. And I'll talk about exactly what happened and how this worked. Okay, before that, I'm going to do a bit of a detour. When I say a field experiment, what's a field experiment and how does it work? Has anybody heard of field experiments? Okay, so a couple of people. So why do we need experiments? A field experiment or experiment is, maybe I should have put the last point below at the top. It's a randomized controlled trial, or what we would call a clinical trial in medicine. Okay, so think of a clinical trial in medicine. You go in, someone gets a treatment, someone doesn't get a treatment, and they're picked randomly. You have some probability of getting treated, and then they follow you and see how effective this medication is, right? And we have a very well-functioning FDA that sets up clinical trial processes. So a bunch of us here at MIT, it's a group called the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, which is just in the building next door, have created a set of academics who try to bring this approach to economic policy in poor countries, okay? Given resources are scarce and we don't know where to spend them, we might want to figure out what's cost effective before we do it everywhere, okay? And so over the last 10, 12 years, there's been a big push towards running these sorts of field experiments in developing countries to understand cost effectiveness. Okay, and 10 years later, if you go see the Poverty Action Lab's website, you'll see just how many studies have been done. I think it's something like 150 in 30 countries, no, 50 countries, something like that. Okay, and so this approach allows you to really understand what the policy you're implementing does. Okay, and the reason is just correlation is not causality. Okay, so let me give you the example that I'm talking about today. If you look across countries, the US has stronger institutions than Kenya, no shock and horror. Okay, Europe largely has stronger institutions than Kenya, largely stronger institutions than India, than all of Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, participation is actually lower in the US and Europe than it is in Africa. Okay, so that means that your institutions are good, and then you undermine political participation because they're good. Well, no, that's not true. It's because good institutions come with other stuff, and lots of other things drive political participation. Okay, so just because I see a correlation that there's good institutions and high participation and bad institutions, good institutions and low participation and bad institutions and high participation doesn't mean that the institutions are having an effect on participation, okay? And so institutions are correlated with all sorts of other outcomes. Political participation is correlated with all sorts of other outcomes. Okay, and that's why to understand what exactly those causality aspects are, what drives political participation, you can use these field experiments, okay? All right. Okay, so what is an experiment? Basically, you take a bunch of people before you decide to run a policy of some sort, okay? And there are all types of people. So here's my sort of group of people to start with, okay? And I can survey them beforehand if I want and run a baseline survey or not. And then I'm going to pick randomly into two groups, okay? And one's called the intervention group, and one is called the status quo group, okay? And these are sort of completely randomly drawn, like out of a hat. So you'll see, there's the same numbers of different colors to show you that those groups will be identical ex ante, okay? In all characteristics, they'll be absolutely identical ex ante because I drew them randomly, okay? And then one group will get the intervention and one won't, and then I'll follow them and see what happens, okay? So that's the idea of a field experiment. It's just with a policy process in the field somewhere, not a clinical trial in a hospital here, okay? Good. Okay, so let me do a bit of background on Kenya, and then I'll talk about the field experiment and how we designed it in Kenya, okay? So Kenya had a bit of democracy in 1963, largely, for all intents and purposes, none, and then was forced to become a multi-party democracy by the IMF through the Washington Consensus because they needed aid in 1992. Okay, and it was largely a dictatorial, closed economy before that. It's still a very long road towards free and fair elections. Okay, they had elections in 92, 97, and 2007, all of which were marred by quite a lot of violence and allegations of corruption and vote buying and ballot stuffing and the list of everything you could think of, okay? The 2002 election was the first and the only, well, 2013 will be there, but largely the first peaceful transition of power post-democracy coming in, okay? So like I mentioned, the 2007 elections were pretty bad, maybe the worst they've seen. Okay, a very large number of people were displaced, and actually a lot of these people are still not back in their homes. And the conflict ended with a power-sharing agreement between the two sides who are fighting over who won. Okay, anybody who looks at the ballot papers or anything realizes that there was so much fiddling with the vote, you could never tell who won. Okay, both sides rigged and rigged like crazy. Ballot boxes were stuffed. Dead people were voting. Turnout was 200%. Okay, all sorts of things happened. And so there's no way to back out who actually won. So lots of voter fraud. And the Electoral Commission, so think of the Federal Election Commission here. And in Kenya, take your Federal Election Commission and marry it with your Electoral College all into one. Okay, that's what we have. Okay, so think that that was the institution running the election, and they were largely blamed. Okay, they said the misconduct came from them. A lot of people felt like the fraud came after the counting started. The truth is there was fraud everywhere, probably in every point in the process. So the commission was completely disbanded. Kenyans were promised sort of a new set of institutions and actually a new constitution. I should point out at this point, they actually don't have a constitution. They have a constitution from the British, and they've never passed their own constitution ever. Okay, which is a pretty big deal not to have a real constitution. right? And the Constitution from the British, they wrote in one-party rule, and so that never actually got changed, okay? So they're going to bring in a new constitution in 2010, also after much discussion and fighting. But it was passed by a large majority in 2010, and it shifted the entire political system. Okay, they moved from what looks like a British parliamentary system with one house to what looks like a US parliamentary system with two houses. Okay, so we now have counties instead of states. We have as many counties as you have states almost, and our population is about 20%. Okay. But we have governors and senators in separate houses now, okay? So we moved from this unicameralism or one-house system to a bicameralism system. Okay, this was a pretty big change, okay? Before, you were only voting for three candidates: president, the MP that you had in parliament, and some ward representative who did the square root of nothing, okay? If he was given any money, he would do something. He never got any funds ever. There was no decentralization. Everything was completely centralized through ministries. Okay, so essentially you were voting for two or three people, but the third person largely didn't matter. Okay, when you shifted, you were going to vote for president, for the MP, who now largely does nothing, and then these new governors and senators, who are the ones who decide local public goods, which means you actually create the equivalent of states, we call them counties, with a county budget. So there's now actually local administration for the first time in the country, where the governors and the senators have control over a pot of money to allocate something in your state or your county, okay? And so you have to vote for them, and then you're going to vote for a county assembly ward representative. This is the old ward representative, except he sits now on the county assembly and has a vote. Okay, so he can vote for what you want. So he's your representative in the Senate. And then a women's representative. This is a funny addition because the Constitution they wrote said they needed representation from women in this process. Okay, and it turns out women don't tend to participate and run for governor, senator, MP. So they created a women's rep because otherwise by the Constitution your government would not pass the constitutional requirement that you need a third woman. And so the way they enforce it is like, okay, so we're just going to have everybody elect a woman to be on the Senate, okay? So again, this women's rep is supposed to represent women's issues and is elected to be have a vote in Senate for what your public goods should be. Okay, so it's a pretty big change, and it's a change towards actually having votes on people who actually do stuff, right? I know the president does, but someone locally who actually should implement for you, okay? All right, along with that came the establishment of a proper Supreme Court with actually an extremely well-respected Supreme Court justice, okay? And a new electoral commission called the IEBC. Okay, so it's the, I'll refer to them as IEBC, but it's the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, okay? Boundaries because they had to decide where these counties were. So they had to create an institution that decides, I'm going to draw a county boundary here and a county boundary here. Okay, so this is the new constitution that comes in, and this is the IEBC. So it's an independent body created to run the election. Okay, so they basically ran the constitutional referendum that got us the Constitution in 2010, and they ran a bunch of by-elections pretty successfully. The big thing they did in the 2013 election, which actually is not done except in developing countries as far as I can tell, is to create a voter register with biometrics. Okay, so I'm going to fingerprint everybody if they want to vote. Okay, and if you show up to vote on that day, it's like any of you foreigners entering the US, they take your biometrics. It's like that to vote. Okay, and a lot of Africa is actually implementing this. It happened in Ghana, in Sierra Leone. I think Nigeria is starting it. Okay, so a lot of places have decided one way to get fraud out of the register, where you don't have people who are dead on the registers, you don't have fake people on the registers, is you implement biometrics. So in the space of about 30 to 40 days, basically, the entire country got re-registered or had to re-register to vote. If you're registered last time, sorry, it doesn't count because I need some fingerprints and a photograph. And without that, you can't register, okay? And so in a month and a half, they basically registered about 14 million people. Okay, and this is pretty impressive because it's really hard to do this. Okay, India is independently trying to do biometric cards for distributing, targeted income stuff, right? Like food subsidies and things like that. and they can't get this fast very quick. But it turns out if you're telling people the only way to vote is this, they somehow show up and get registered. Okay, so they create this brand new electronic biometric identified voter register with the idea it's now clean, right? If you didn't have fingerprints, you can't go onto the register, okay? All right, and in 2012, before the election, you know, a lot of people, given the history of electoral commissions in the country, were actually pretty confident that the commission would do a good job and would run this election effectively, okay? So they seem to have succeeded in creating a set of institutions that people believed in, and a set of institutions that were trying to do things to make this a free and a fair election, okay? So here's the registration process. You can see you go in and sign up with your biometrics, okay? So here's what happened in elections in 2007. This is what happened in elections in 2013, okay? A nice difference to see. And you'll see institutions. This was the institution in 2007. People took to the streets, destroyed property, destroyed roads, burnt cars. There is a contested election even in 2013. They go to the Supreme Court, okay? So it's a pretty big change in how people are sort of interacting with this newly set up set of institutions, okay? Okay, so now let me talk about the field experiments we did. We actually did two. The first one was a door-to-door canvassing for registration, like you would do door-to-door canvassing in the US, in this big slum in Nairobi where we were working. I'm not gonna show any of those results, but I'm gonna talk about this part of the field experiment. So we worked with the commission to basically send about 10 million texts across the country. Okay, so about 1.8 million people got a text every day for 6 days. And I'll show you exactly what those texts say, but we'll vary all the texts and the information that was given out, okay? And this is pretty cheap to do, okay? 10 million texts cost, even though texts cost nothing, 10 million cost something because they're 10 million, okay? But it's reasonably cheap to do. About half the country was involved in this field experiment, as I'll show you. Okay, so it's a pretty big field experiment orchestrated across the country. Okay, so I'm going to focus on that and show you what it did. Okay, so there's about 25,000 polling stations in the country. Polling station is it called a polling station in the US? Yeah, basically, okay. I don't vote in the US because I'm not an American, so I don't know what all the bits and pieces are called. So about half of them was selected to be in our experiment. Okay, and the reason we picked half is when you registered, they asked you for a phone number and you gave them a phone number, okay? But we wanted the places that had lots of phone numbers because there's no point including places where people didn't have phone numbers because you're not gonna be able to get them information by text. So we basically picked all the polling stations where at least a quarter of the registered voters had a phone number, okay? And so that got us to about half the polling stations in the country. Half of these were in our control, picked randomly through just like out of a hat, essentially. And the other half were treated as in they were the ones who got texts, okay? And the text messages were sent by the main cell phone provider in Kenya called Safaricom, which has something like 90% market share. Okay, so we didn't have to worry that we weren't getting people's other numbers because most people are on this network. Okay, so the treated polling stations, right, the half that got a message, we assigned them randomly to 3 different types of groups, or 3 different types of messages. The first group was just an encouragement to vote. Hey, go out and vote. It's important to vote. It's important to have a say in the process. Please go vote. You know, the election's on the 4th, go vote. Okay, so just basic, pure mobilization, getting people out to vote messages. The second one was a sense of mobilization, as well as in each message we gave you some information on each of those other positions. Not president, everybody knows president and everybody knows they need to vote for president. But in the other 5, so we basically said, make sure you vote for governor. It's really important to vote for governor because he controls what public goods get spent, what arrives in your county. Okay, so each message had sort of a, make sure you vote for this person because they're important for XYZ reason, okay? And then the third group was about trying to give people information on these institutions, okay? We can't change institutions randomly, but we can remind people randomly about what these institutions did, okay? So the third set of messages were, remember the IEBC is trying to run a free and fair election. Remember, the IEBC created an electronic register to make sure there's no voter fraud in the register, okay? Remember, the IEBC ran this very, very big by-election. We had someone killed in a plane crash, and they did it well and fine, and the vote was clean, okay? And so basically trying to remind people that, look, IEBC is trying to do a good job and trying to manage a free and fair election process, okay? The other thing we did was we wanted to know if people actually communicate when they get their messages. Okay, so imagine I sent Sherry a message. If he talked to his neighbors about it, then I don't need to send his neighbors messages, right? I just need to send it to him. So in some of them, we sent it to everybody who had a phone number. And in some groups, we only sent it to half. And the idea is you can compare these to see, well, maybe half is enough because they all talk to each other anyways. And so you didn't need to do it to everybody. Okay, so that's the experimental design we used. Like I said, there were about 1.8 million people received text messages. Okay, so these are examples, okay? And maybe I'll show the full lists quickly. So these are the 6 messages you got if it was mobilization, right? It's your duty to vote. Go vote for good leaders. A good citizen helps promote democracy. Remember the general election is this day. Remember how to vote. Remember that you need your ID, of course, shockingly, okay? So a bunch of just go out to vote. It's your right to vote. It's your duty to vote. Please go vote, okay? Treatment 2, like I said, was about these positions, okay? Some mobilization, vote. And then you also got these, which is, your government will manage funds on your behalf. Make sure you pick him right. Your senator will determine how many resources you receive from the central government. You need to vote for the right guy, okay? And so basically outlining why each of these positions is important for you to vote for. And then treatment 3 was about the Electoral Commission, okay? Saying, look, the IBC is an independent body created by the new institution. It's trying to do free, fair elections. It created this biometric register. All that sorts of stuff, okay? It's managed a bunch of by-elections very well. Go vote. Okay, so those were the text messages that basically went out across the country, okay? Okay, now what data did we have? We're gonna have a bunch of administrative data from the election. Okay, so we have how many people were registered at each polling station, but we also have what the turnout was at each polling station, the votes for each candidate, et cetera, et cetera. The mobile phone company tracked how many of the messages got sent because handsets usually respond when they receive a text. And so they can keep track of how many actually got sent, okay? And then we have a whole bunch of outcomes data, right? Once the election was done, you have all the turnouts, you have who showed up, you have who was running the polling station, you have candidate votes, et cetera, all at the polling station level. Okay, and so this is an example of turnout, and actually turnout is usually quite high. Okay, so the election outcomes data was stream level. Okay, what does this mean? At a polling station, if it's a big polling station, you have a A to N, or A to M and N to Z. Okay, those are streams. And these were actually all entered on hand. There is no actual electronic entry of voting, okay, in Kenya. And so we got a whole bunch of handwritten forms, 33,000 of them, and they were then entered electronically, okay, which is fun to do. And then about 9 or so months after the election, we took a random sample of people from the people who got texts, and we collected a bunch of survey data. Okay, so we called them up, and then we asked them sort of this short half-hour module on political participation and attitudes and trust and socioeconomics. What's their income? What's their education? Et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let me show you some results finally after all that. So this is a text message success rate. These were the dates. So the 4th of March was the election. So we sent one message on the day of the election at like 9 a.m., okay, so early. The first one has a lower success rate, and that's just because the first one only got out in the afternoon. And so the way the cell phone company does it is they send out the message. If it doesn't go through, they repeat, and if it doesn't go through, they repeat. If you start in the afternoon, they only give you so many repeats until the end of the day. If you start in the morning, you get a better success rate, okay? So that one started in the afternoon, and then the rest went out largely in the morning, okay? The black line here is the treatment group 1, so again, just basic motivation to vote. Remember, treatment 2 is the your governor, senator matter, and then the third one is about the IEBC. Yeah?
What do you mean success rate? Like, I think they got it, or?
Yeah, the handset responded that they had received it. Whether they don't know if you read it. They know your handset kind of gives them a blip back saying, got it. So that's the success rate, was the handset recognized and recognized the receipt. Yeah. Okay, and then on the survey data we know, because we asked people if they got text. Okay? Now this was 9 months ago, so it turns out that they don't know so well. Okay? And you'll see that the IBC actually bombarded people during registration and before registration. So the IBC had a deal with the cell phone company to text everybody in the country about 50 to 100 times to tell them to go register. Okay, and that's because they were so freaked out that they wouldn't get the register done in time. They started the register in November, your election's in March, right? You're looking at like, okay, so the 4th of March, and you open the register on the 1st of November to register people. And so they bombarded people with registration messages. So you'll see a lot of people, that's what they remember. Okay, it's going to be this huge slew of messages about go register, go register. Okay, so we asked people, did you receive a text during the elections? The black from now on will be the control group. Okay, so these are the guys who didn't get anything other than what the IBC was doing. So, and the other advantage of the IBC doing registration is they spent so much money on this that they had no money left for texting for the rest of the election. So the only texts that went out after registration were basically ours. Okay. So, so the control got basically everything up to registration, and then from us, they got nothing. Treatment 1, again, is just basic motivation. Treatment 2 is the positions, and treatment 3 is IBC. So you can see for all of our guys, they were much more likely to report having gotten a text, okay? And we actually asked them, did you get a text from the, did you get a text about elections after registration, okay? That was the idea. So they're much more likely to say they got texts. They report about, on average, 1 more text, okay? Not 6, but 1. It's not surprising, 9 months later, do you remember exactly how many you got? I don't know. And they're likely not on their phones still 9 months later, okay? But they do report receiving more texts. They report receiving more texts from the IBC, because these texts were technically from the IBC, okay? And then we asked them do you remember what the texts were about? And the people who got our text said yes, they were more likely to remember, because remember, our texts were more recent than the registration ones. And we asked them, okay, what were these texts about? And the idea is we want to make sure that they actually got these, right? The cell phone company goes, oh yeah, we send them here as success rates. You want to make sure that people actually got them. We'd actually added a bunch of our field team numbers to those numbers, so we knew that at least they went out in some grand sense. But here's what they were about. So a bunch of people said, we had various versions of encouraging me to go out and vote, turnout. Okay, so some motivation to go vote and reminding you to vote, okay? And so they're much more likely to say that they got messages reminding them to vote, okay? Across all groups, actually, but primarily in treatment 1, which was the big sort of motivating people to go vote. Yeah?
Can you explain what's on the y-axis there?
Yes.
0.28, 0.3, 0.32.
So this one is just what fraction of people said that they received a message about turnout. Of the people who said they got a message, that's 0.28, 28%.
It seems pretty consistent then. I mean, if you're 0.3 or 0.32, like 30% said one thing, 32% said another thing.
Absolutely, but those are statistically different. Because we have, a million, we have half the country. So that's the advantage. I mean, texting is going to do stuff, but it's going to be small magnitude, right? On the margin, when we thought about how big we needed this to be, right, how many people do you think you're going to motivate to go out and vote who ain't going to go vote with a text?
Statistically significant, yet it's not 20%, 70%. I mean, we're not seeing wild swings. Even though you can
absolutely not. And you're not going to see wild swings in turnout. We're going to get 2 or 3 percentage point higher turnout. Okay, but turnout is 84% already, right? And the question is whether that turnout is worth it. Probably, because the texting is so cheap, right? Now, we only did the text the week before. You can imagine doing this in a more harassing way, in quotes, right? But, given how much it costs, getting 2 or 3 percentage points in turnout is impressive, right? I think our co-author in Paris did a whole bunch of door-to-door. What did he get in turnout? Do you remember, Ben?
I don't remember when you used to say that.
Yeah, it's about the same magnitude, right? So door-to-door canvassing, usually in the US, if you think of the Victory Lab book, which is about the US elections, right? 2 or 3 percentage points for them is a lot. It's a really big deal, right? And what you'll see is actually 2 or 3 percentage points could swing elections, right? Elections that are this tight, it could absolutely swing elections. It could swing the US election if it's 3 percentage points. So again, and then that's the average for the country, right? One thing we haven't done is very carefully is look at, maybe it was all poor people. And then it ends up being 10% of poor people turned up who didn't, right? So things like that might be bigger. So it might be much bigger, which is what the France study finds is even though overall it's small, you have these huge changes for immigrants and for poorer people. There was a question back there.
Overlapping bands, so you said there's significant, but
Yeah, so actually, so stats lesson is that you don't have to have them unoverlapping for it to be significant. They can be overlapping and still statistically significant because this is just the standard error around this value, not the standard error around the mean. The difference, sorry. So what you really want is 2 times the standard error around the difference, which is not necessarily the same as those 2 bars. So if they're completely separate, that's sufficient to say it is. If they're a little overlapping, they largely are. So technical, right? And if they're really, really overlapping, then they're probably not. But I just decided not to put up a whole bunch of regression tables and numbers because they're kind of boring, right? Pictures are just a bit more fun. But yeah, so they can be a little overlapping. But in the paper, we've got all the regression tables behind it, which show the significance. Yeah, at the back.
Yes, thank you. This actually seems to be a good time to ask this question.
Sure, go for it.
First of all, how did you control for the socioeconomic status and ownership of mobile devices which are capable of receiving the texts? In the US and Europe, there is a trend towards people with higher socioeconomic status owning a higher percentage of mobile devices that are capable of texting.
Yeah, so all the phones in Kenya can text for sure. And actually, the advantage of working in Kenya is that most households have a phone. Something like 98% of households have a phone. And the reason is not because only they love phones. It's the most successful case of mobile money in the world. 90% of households have a mobile money account, which is basically like a bank account on your phone when you don't have a bank account. So with the advent of mobile money in Kenya over the last 6 years, it means that everybody now has a phone in the house. It doesn't mean everybody, there might be one phone between me, my wife, and my 2 adult kids. So a household has a phone. Doesn't mean everybody. Every person has a phone.
So in your research, were you able to actually eliminate the possible bias of socioeconomic status for actually receiving the texts?
So, the bias is all eliminated through the randomization, right? So we sent texts, and we just look at polling station level aggregates. So it is the case that some people were moved who had phones, but in general, all we're looking at is this. That's why you randomize, right? Because I don't want it to be only affecting rich or poor people. Because I've got a control group in which we don't do anything, that comparison becomes valid. Now, it might be that there are bigger differences in how the rich and poor respond because the poor have less phones in the house, for example. And we can look at that, whether the poor respond less. From what we've looked at, actually, it's the opposite. They had bigger effects on the poor. And you can talk about why that might be. Like I said, most households have a phone, so it's not about the phone per se. I think the reason it maybe has more effects on the poor is they get less text messages in general, right? And so they might be more likely to look at ours than other people who are getting loads of others if people are working on their cell phones and they're just like, oh, some silly message I don't want to know. But anything we see in the data is actually the poor respond in bigger ways than the rich. Yeah.
To my next question.
Sure.
Did you notice in analyzing your data, were you able to determine whether or not there was a bias from the intervention towards a particular party or candidates, or did you not measure the result?
Yeah, largely we don't see a change in vote share. I'll tell you, so we used vote share at the polling station, not self-reported who did you vote for in party, because the survey only just ended. And so that's not fully clean. In the aggregates, we don't see a big change in vote share at all. And we can check then at the individual level, was it people from one party more likely to respond? And that's on our to-do list, actually. Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
on the actual selection of candidates, what is the process for the selection of individual party candidates? I mean, is it still largely on a tribal basis? Or
Yeah. So parties are largely tribal. That's absolutely true and still true and will be true for a long time to come as far as I can tell. Now, the population of adults in the country is something like 20 million. 12,000 people ran for office, okay, which is astronomical, okay, because there were 50 parties and they put up candidates, who knows what. Okay, so basically a lot of people ran for stuff, and it's because there's this perception that you'll get stuff, right? But parties tend to be tribal. Now, what usually happens is, you know, there's 5 big tribes in Kenya plus a whole load of others, okay? But the 5 big sort of determine everything. You need to create coalitions because no one guy's going to win this thing, and running against each other is completely unproductive. And so there'll be 2 or 3 tribes that get together to create a coalition, and the presidential candidate will run from that. What's weird is when they did that, right, there was one group saying, oh, 6 votes, 6 votes, 1 party, which means if you were part of a coalition, but your guy wasn't running for president, you'd run for the guy who was running, you know, you'd vote president for the guy who was in the coalition, but then they were saying, oh, but you want to vote for his party all the way down. And people were like, actually, no. So that's good that that didn't work, right? So there are, at the presidential level, you'll get that. But at the local level, then you'll still get these, you know, various parties that came together in that coalition.
good start anyway.
Exactly. But there was one guy going around, 6 votes, 1 party, and I went, why on earth? Like, and largely people didn't. You know, when we ask people to report parties that they are affiliated with, like we haven't looked at what he asked for, but we know what parties are affiliated with, and largely they report actually individual parties rather than the coalition, right? The people reporting the coalition is a very small fraction, yeah, which is good.
How is literacy affecting this process?
Yeah, so largely literacy is quite good now. There's 2 reasons. One is free primary education came in quite a long time ago, now 12, 13 years ago, which means all older kids are now reasonably literate because they all went to primary school. And so even if adults are not literate, the kids are, which is great. So in mobile money, for example, the one thing that you realize is people use this phone to basically text money to people, right? I can load money, not airtime credit, actual cash onto my phone, and I can send it to you by text. And I type in your number and say, send, sorry, I don't know your name, but send Mr. X, you know, $10, and you get a text immediately saying Tavneet sent you $10. And so that requires literacy. And it turns out, again, you know, when we ask people who are not literate, they ask their kids to actually do it for them. So in general, if they get a text, it's really funny. They immediately hand the phone to someone who can read and say, tell me what it says. And so there has been this shift. It's very weird, right? Usually parents tell kids what to do, but you do see this in households where the head is illiterate, that because mobile money is already there, this is our big saving grace, right? Is that people know how to interact with cell phones in a pretty impressive way already, because they are calling and they're texting and they're sending money on their phones and they're paying bills on their phones and they're paying school fees on their phones and they're doing all sorts of stuff on their phones. And these are like not smartphones at all, right? This is the Nokia brick that does absolutely nothing except text, right? So this is all done by text.
How many different languages do you have?
Lots.
And so how does that affect you?
So we did everything in English, because English is one of the national languages. And all of schooling is largely in English. So again, if you went to primary school, you were largely taught in English. No one's teaching in Swahili. And Swahili is the other language, the large national language. And then there's lots of tribal languages. Yeah. Okay. Any others? Yeah.
I'm actually curious about the data you showed, the discrepancy for the U.S. in terms of education and income.
Mm-hmm.
One of the criticisms of the U.S. process is that elections held on Tuesday, right? And the less education you have, the poorer you have, the less flexibility you have in your job.
Yeah,
means
absolutely.
You don't have the time to
go vote. Absolutely.
So I was wondering, what would that look like if you showed that that distribution in developed countries where you voted on a weekend, or how you still find the same discrepancy in income and education, or does that disappear?
I don't know the answer to that at all. I can look it up. The problem is also the presidential election is largely held on a weekday. I might not want to compare turnout for a non-presidential by-election of some sort that happened to be on a Saturday or something. Oh, you mean across?
Yeah, but I think in France.
Oh, right.
Germany, I think
So France, is it held on a holiday?
Oh, and I think on the weekend.
It's held on a Sunday.
Yeah.
And turnout is higher, but
But actually, our co-author has papers on votes of immigrants.
Okay.
Who tend to vote significantly less than non-immigrants, which
Yeah.
is another version of the same
yeah. So he even in France, that's right. But the canvassing, so the big thing in France that mattered for them was these people weren't registered. So not only did they not have to, if you had time to go vote on a Saturday, did you have time to go to City Hall and get registered? Which is also the same thing because it turns out City Hall is not open on a Saturday. So what our co-author did in France is actually give these people help with registering. So he went to their house and said, here's a form, let me fill it for you, I'll take it to City Hall, I'll go do all the work for you. And then the only people who basically mattered there were immigrants. You know, the big take-up of this was immigrants, those were the ones more likely to register. And then if you're registered, they're much more likely to vote. So the US, this was participation based on registration, but I don't know what registration looks like. And so registration is some of the issue too. Do people actually register to vote? In Kenya, the elections are actually on a weekday, but they call it public holiday on that day. So even though it's a weekday, it's technically a holiday for everybody. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so, and then we asked if messages were about the positions. You can see in treatment 2, people say yes. And then we asked if they were about registration, and basically all of our treatments were less likely to say they were about registration. And this is because they received something after registration, and the only thing they received after registration was us. Okay, so they do report getting messages about registration, but they report them much less than everybody else. Okay, so let me show you turnout. I'll show it to you based on 2 things. One is votes cast, so the total number of votes that were cast on election day, and the valid votes. Okay, so it's going to exclude spoiled votes and rejected votes, right? Spoiled votes are where they couldn't figure out what you wrote, or someone said, I love this party all over the ballot, and you don't count that, okay, things like that. And then, so the first one, and so I should tell you what happened during the election. So the election went off reasonably peacefully. The electronics had biometrics, and these largely failed, actually. The biometric machines that you use to register people's prints basically lasted for the first 3 or 4 hours and then died. And the large reason they died was they were connected to laptops that ran out of power, and they forgot to get, what are they called, extension cables to hook laptops up to power. So so it means laptops basically ran out of power if you were too far, if the polling booth was too far from a power plug, okay? Which a chunk were. And so basically about 11 o'clock on the day, you see that people can't use the biometric ID kits anymore, and this cycles through the country, and it's a large amount of unhappiness over this because, again, you're supposed to be able to do this, and it's free and fair. And they had a backup with actual lists, right, printed out lists. But the whole point of this was to use biometrics, okay, and it largely failed. The other thing that the biometrics was accompanied with, because the votes were going into a laptop, they'd worked with Safaricom and actually IBM and Google, reasonably reputable companies, right, to take those votes every few hours and put them up online, okay? So you can actively report because you're doing biometrics, and it was set up to basically just send a message every few hours saying, there's X people this, and this is the average vote tally coming out, basically, from the system. Okay, so this started, so you start see Google's like projecting out like on a map, right? And it's stunning to see all these results, except it just all entirely crashes at about 11 o'clock, okay? And disappears very fast, and then they're like, okay, we have to manually count everything now from scratch because we don't want to use this because we don't know what exactly got reported where. And so they start this huge, massive manual count of like 13 million votes, okay? Which is going to now last 3 or 4 days instead of 24 hours in this electronic system. Okay, and then, of course, we instituted in the Constitution another thing, which is sort of the French rule, the 50% rule. You need to get at least 50% of the vote. If not, the top 2 candidates go to a runoff. Okay, this is a pretty expensive thing to do, right? And so one party won, but the big contention was whether they would make the 50% or not. And they came in, I think the technical number is something like 12,000 votes over the 50%. Okay, we don't have an automatic recount, sadly. And so the opposition basically said, no, 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 there's problems in the count. This is the problems. We're going to oppose the vote. And they filed cases in the Supreme Court immediately, saying that there should have been a runoff because they didn't go over this 50%. Okay, now 12,000 votes, potentially is a very, very, very small number. Okay, and so, participation can certainly affect things like that. Okay, so the IBC uses cast votes to determine turnout. And then when the court cases ended up in the Supreme Court, all of them, and not just political party filed cases, actually people filed cases in the Supreme Court. I think there were probably several hundred cases in the Supreme Court, okay, eventually over this. The Supreme Court basically has no jurisdiction over the commission. The Supreme Court can say, we think this is the right thing to do, but it's up to the commission to do it. We can't tell them what to do. So the Supreme Court interpret the Constitution saying you want to use valid votes and not cast votes. Okay, and this is a big deal because vote fractions change depending on what your denominator is, okay? And so this was a big point of contention in the Supreme Court as well. Okay, so here's turnout. So you can see that's the control, the 3 treatments. You'll see basically we're having a reasonable sized effect here. It's going to end up being about a percentage point and a bit, okay? Here it's a little less. This one tends to be just marginally statistically significant. And then in this treatment, we largely did nothing, okay? So telling people the commission is very good and does very good things does absolutely nothing as far as we can tell. Okay, and you'll see that throughout. That's cast votes. This is valid votes, okay? This is by the spillover. So this is where we treated a full and a half. So you can see that if we treated a full, it has a bigger effect than if we treated half. So think of this as full half in treatment 1, full half in treatment 2, full half in treatment 3, okay? So it isn't that people are going and telling everybody about text messages when they get them. And those effects are pretty much half. So it feels like they're actually not going out and telling people, okay? Here's the turnout in the survey data, okay? So you'll see about a 2 percentage point effect in the survey data, okay? And that's across all groups. Now, a lot of people, especially political scientists in this country, have realized that survey data for political stuff is not great. Okay? So you'll see turnout in the election was more like 85%. Turnout in the survey data is 93%. There's a bunch of people who say they voted who didn't vote. Okay? And that's true in the US. In the US, if you ask people, did you vote, and you look at turnout, there's a huge difference between people say they voted versus who actually voted. And the reason is no one actually wants to say they didn't vote because you're supposed to vote, right? And so no one actually wants to admit not voting. Okay, so that's turnout in the survey data, but we don't, it's good, it's consistent, but with a pinch of salt that some people may be lying. Okay, and then the other thing I'm going to show you, and then I'll try and do something slightly different towards the end. We have lots of data, and we have lots of weeks to spend analyzing it, which we will. But one thing we asked was about trust in the institutions. Okay, so trust in the Supreme Court, trust in normal institutions like the police, which shouldn't be affected unless there's violence, which there wasn't, and trust in the commission. Okay, and the reason was, like I said, the entire electronic system disappeared, right? The whole point of them collecting all your biometrics suddenly just did not function on the day. And people were unhappy about this, right? And the political parties certainly used it, right? Suddenly it's like, oh, now I can fight things because this whole thing collapsed and I think you rigged the vote, which is why it collapsed, right? Of course, it was certainly the case that there was a lot of incompetency, okay? And you can set up these institutions, but you realize that they do come with their set of people, right? It is not going to be the best run institution no matter what you do, okay? The state of the world is that these institutions will be what they are. And so how do you function? So we basically ask people about trust. And there's, do you trust the police? Basically, there's no difference, okay? Nobody reports really any difference between trusting the police and the control and the treatments. If you trust the Supreme Court, maybe a bit less, right? And this might be people who felt like, we told them things would be fair, and then the Supreme Court voted one way or the other, and they weren't happy with that. But none of these are statistically significant at all, so they're only very, very suggestive, if that. But this is the big one that matters, okay? This is definitely statistically significant, and these are marginal, okay? So we actually reduced trust in the commission, okay? And so remember, this is relative to the control who didn't get text messages. So this is actually stunning, that a text message, again, can reduce trust. And the reason is, we sent you messages to say things would be great because you have this new commission, and then when it does badly, you feel worse than the person who wasn't told that they were going to be great, okay? And so you can build up these institutions, but trying to create credibility and trust in them is really, really hard, because they can do something that's not even, trying to rig the vote, just complete pure incompetence. And that means that if you had prompted people to say, oh, look, all these great things are going to happen, they're going to react to that prompting in a bad way, okay? And so trust is just really, really hard to build too, okay? And so you have to think carefully about what it means to really collapse and, and have incompetence. I think they need to get to the point where they know that they're incompetent and cannot pull off 13 million votes this way, right? It's really funny, after the election, they had to have another by-election because an MP was killed, and they had it, and they ran it with the same kits, and it went fine. And I was like, yes, I understand you can run one little thing, right? But running across 25,000 polling stations is a big deal, and it's a much bigger deal, okay? Okay, so for the last few minutes I have, I want to do a bit more. I mentioned JPAL here at MIT, and there's been this governance initiative at JPAL, which has really started to think about, how do we get poor people to participate more, to get better information. And so I want to give you highlights from a brand new study that they've just done in Sierra Leone. And it's going to be a similar case in that these are reasonably poor institutional environments, right? The institutions are new, they're not credible, they're not built, or they don't exist, okay? And so in this case, it's about voter information in Sierra Leone. I'll explain this picture in a second. But basically, this is a place where voter information doesn't really exist, okay? So unlike India, which has now a well-flourishing sort of Right to Information Act, where you can actually get what MPs spent in every place and how it was and what they did, there's no official information on MPs available in Sierra Leone. There's a brand new Freedom of Information Act, but there's no regulation about what you actually do. They say, we have a Freedom of Information Act, but there's no real understanding of what that is yet. It wasn't there during the last election. In fact, MPs didn't have to report anything to anyone about what they spent, and all the money that they got from the central government went into their personal bank accounts to spend. Okay, so they didn't even have a separate bank account for the funds from the government. Okay, so and it's just because there's not that many banks and there's not that many bank accounts. Okay, probably, maybe a bit more of other things, but okay. So what did these guys do? They said, okay, look, it's really hard to get information on how good your MPs were. So what we're going to do is, we can't collect this information because the MPs don't even report it to the government. So it's not like we can go collect it and distribute it. So they decided they would have a taped debate in a bunch of constituencies. So they got the candidates together, and they ran a debate. Okay, now it doesn't look like our presidential debate here, I understand. But this is a debate in a constituency. Okay, and the two parties are the red and the green. Okay. This is a minor third party that does nothing in the election largely. And this is a famous radio, TV personality who's moderating the debate, okay? And so he runs this debate to ask them about policies and platforms and everything. Now, of course, most people don't have TV. So even if it's on TV, it doesn't matter. So what they did was they taped it, and then they went to a bunch of villages and set up a massive screen outside and did this massive outdoor airing of the debates, okay? And this was a pretty cheap and easy way to get information about your candidates out there when there's no records anywhere to use, okay? And so they did this across, I think, 24 constituencies in Sierra Leone. And let me tell you, so they taped these debates. It was organized by this NGO in Sierra Leone that's very active in elections, Search for Common Ground. And there's pretty big turnout for the screening. Okay? Turns out, Sierra Leone is what? Top 10 poorest countries in the world. If someone comes and sets up a big screen, most people flock to see what it's about. Okay? So they had sort of 200 people plus at each of these screenings, okay? Which is pretty big. Okay, so let me show you what happened. They were much more likely to know how much was in the Constituency Development Fund, how much was allocated by the central government to the Constituency Development Fund, because the moderator had asked us in the debate, for example, okay? They are much more likely to know which candidate is better educated. Okay? They're more likely to know SLPP is one of the party's priority issue. They're much more likely to know APC's big thing was free healthcare, so they're much more likely to know about their free healthcare. Okay? And then in outcomes, they asked who you voted for, okay? And they found that people were more aligned with the candidate's priority issue, and they were much more likely to vote for the debate winner. Okay, so this seemed like an effective way, at least for people who were on the margin, to figure out who they might want to vote for. Okay? Okay, and this was just, like I said, done in Sierra Leone for the last election, so not that long ago, about a year ago. Okay? I think that's all I have for that. Okay? So again, this was an attempt to get information out, and it was information that we didn't have and that even the government itself didn't have, right? You didn't have any information on what people were doing in these constituencies, and so it's not like there's some repository and all we have to do is get it out and send it to people, okay? They had to actually extract it from the politicians, and how do you sell this? You say, oh, we're gonna have a debate with this cool personality, and then tape it and air it, okay? But people do respond to the information, right? They're much more likely to vote for the winner. They're much more likely to know more about the issues, okay? So when I come back to sort of this idea of having, getting the poor a voice, these sorts of things seem to be getting them a voice, right? You're growing their information set so they can understand what the election is about, as opposed to vote for the party that they've always voted for because they voted for the red guys all the time or whatever it is, right? Sierra Leone is a place, just like Kenya, where people tend to vote by ethnicity quite a lot, okay? And some of that is just, they don't know what else is going on, right? They don't know who else is doing what and how much. Okay, and so what is your default? Well, I'll vote for this guy because he's my ethnicity and I hope I'll get more public goods, okay? And instead, you've started to shift that by trying to give them information on who their potential candidates are, okay? And there's a whole bunch of other of these studies going on now, which is an attempt to try to take democracies for what they are and just strengthen those institutions. Try to provide better information, try to broaden reach. And like I said, not just in developing countries. Like I said, our co-author's been working a lot in France and in Europe for exactly the same reasons, is that you encourage a different set of people to participate. Okay? And we see that in some of our data, you're encouraging poorer people to participate. And that might matter. Yeah?
Thank you. In your various field experiments, as you designed these experiments, were you able to control for Hawthorne effects at all in your design?
So some do. There's a big literature on this. Largely in a bunch of ours, not. So does everybody know Hawthorne effects? It's sort of like if you feel like you're being observed, you do different things. One thing we do is we don't implement ourselves, right? So like if you think of this case, the implementation was done by this NGO, Search for Common Ground, right? So we don't usually tend to implement ourselves. We're working with a partner, which is an existing NGO, right? A bunch of our work in Kenya was with the commission, right? So in that sense, we're a bit far apart from the actual implementation. That's not us, largely. So like when our text messages went out, everybody thought they were from the IBC because they came from that sort of style of message, right? And so we just randomized polling stations. Nobody knew we were randomizing polling stations. Nobody knew what was happening. It's only at the end line that we called them, but even then we didn't tell them you don't explain the experiment. You say we're doing a survey on political participation largely. So that's one way to control for them, is not to be directly involved in implementation, and the implementation is going to happen, right? Search for Common Ground was out there and wanted to do something to improve knowledge and voter information about candidates. So in that sense, there's always going to be something going on that would have happened implementation-wise. There's a couple of experiments that people have done to try and look at Hawthorne effects, but they're really hard to cleanly measure, because I need to get people to have the sense they're being observed in exactly the same way without doing the same stuff, right? And so it's almost impossible to say, I'm going to make you feel like you're being observed, but you're not going to get the intervention and you're not going to get this. So it's kind of hard to actually orchestrate in the data. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I understand how text messaging is the most convenient, cheapest way to get the massive volume that you're looking for, but have you seen different types of results depending on the distribution channel that you get out of information?
Yeah, there's not a lot of work on this, it turns out. Partly because we were trying to do, actually, we got asked to do a voter ed program in the field. Now the problem is, like, you know, the Electoral Commission is not the most competent in the world, like I said, you know, for good reason, but you just couldn't pull that off in the time frame, right? Imagine you registered everybody by December. I've got 2 months to plan and implement this massive scale other version of things. So we didn't have the time to do it. People have not compared text to other things, except in the UK, where texts did as well as anything else. But it is the UK, and so we don't know that. I think in the US, certain types of messages do better than others. So the big one, the most effective message in the US is telling people that all their neighbors voted. And so that seems to do the most in turnout, is saying, oh, last year or last election, all your neighbors voted and you were the only one who didn't, which is not true given participation rates, really, but that sort of makes people go and vote. You know, it's your right to vote. It's your duty to vote does a bit, but not as much as the sort of neighbors thing. I think in the US, they find that phone calls are reasonably effective. I don't know if they've done texts, but I do think that phone calls are just as effective as anything else. And so, you know, most of the campaigns use phone calls. There is some door-to-door, but less, yeah. So I think in the developed world, we have stuff. So in the US, if you're interested, there's this book called The Victory Lab, which is about Obama's presidential campaign and how they orchestrated it. And it was a bunch of people who did experiments. This is exactly what they did. They ran a whole load of experiments with a group of academics from all over the US and basically tried all sorts of experiments to basically get out the vote. And get out the vote for them, right? So, but that's all now in this book called The Victory Lab, so you can read about it. Yeah. Yes?
So how are you extending this research further? Are you going to different economies and saying that this is the underlying model that other economies need to adopt? Or perhaps going even further at a higher level, saying mobile and digital is the way to solve the Sub-Saharan problems?
Yeah. I think what I would say on mobile and digital, there's certainly a big role for it in Sub-Saharan Africa. Like I said, with the growth of mobile money, people are very, very used to interacting with cell phones at very low incomes, which is surprising and also great, right? Mobile money has done amazing things in Africa, or in some countries in Africa. And so I think it is a different thing than it is here, right? You had adoption in a decade of 90%. Okay, you don't see that in the US. It took 13 years in the US to hit 30% of the population. Okay, so I think that's certainly true. Mobile technologies can do a whole host of things in Africa that they don't do other places because people are used to interacting with them. But that's certainly not the whole point of the story, right? There's still lots of other bits of participation that you need to think about. Certainly information is important, right? A lot of people tend to vote by tribe, and we're seeing some small bits of evidence now come through that if you provide them information, you're starting to on the margin, break that line. And that's the hardest one to break, right? And so that means it's a better democracy if I don't feel like I have to vote for my tribe, but I want to vote for this guy because he's actually going to do something for me, right? And so I do think thinking about how to strengthen the existing processes that countries have chosen. I would never tell a country to go do what Kenya did with their new constitution, right? A country that size should not have 47 states, and it should not have 6 people per every 47 states running, right? This is one of the most expensive political systems around, given per person, per capita, right? There's just way too many officials per person, so I would never do that. I think countries will choose their own political systems through referenda, which is what it should be, through some. But you want to make sure that those institutions can actually provide value to people, right? And so strengthening participation and strengthening information on the system is, I think, foremost. Yeah?
Today, most of these people have very standard phone.
Yeah.
Given that in 5 to 10 years, every single phone that will be sold will be a smartphone, essentially, how do you think that will impact?
I don't think that's true. So most of them are getting phones, you know from where still? These are all your old phones that you used to use being refurbished.
He has the BlackBerry, so I think.
Maybe his first phone, you know.
Most of them will Wow, smartphones.
Yeah, and I think there'll be refurbished smartphones that your BlackBerry now, right? Like, and they're pretty cheap refurbished, right? A lot of them are not buying new phones. And actually, there's a bunch of Chinese smart-ish phones. You're getting phones that I call smart-ish because they're not, you can do some email, but you can't do a browser or something, right? So, I think that will happen, that you'll get more of those. But in general, it won't be brand new phones. Yeah. And I think, everything they're building works on the most basic phone. It will work on a smartphone. It'll only get better on a smartphone in all likelihood. The big problem with smartphones actually is not even just cost at the moment, it's charging, right? A smartphone doesn't last you a day if you're using it, right? The Nokia bricks last you 3 or 4, right? I'm going to charge them. And these guys don't have power, right? So when you talk about cell phones being successful, it's while they don't have power, right? And what it's created is some guy in the village buys a generator, and you go in to buy milk and bread, and you drop off your phone, and you pick it up 2 hours later. It only takes 2 hours to charge because it's a Nokia brick, right? And it lasts for 3 or 4 days. So I think that's been the saving grace, is that there are these phones that don't require that much power. They also all have a flashlight, which everybody loves. Right? I know new iPhones have a flashlight, but old phones actually all have a flashlight. But yeah, so I think the smartphone problem is actually going to be about charging more than about sort of just the phone cost as well, because you'll have to charge much more often. Yeah. Yes?
Were you able to track the result of the voters who voted before the biometric system broke down? And were their T3 result different from after?
We would love to do that. We can't do that because voting is technically not linked to, you can't tell. So we would have to know who voted when, at what time, and we would have to have all the electronic results before that. Both of things which are largely not available and probably maybe shouldn't be. I don't know. Maybe to researchers they should be, but no, those are largely not available. Yeah.
Is the T2 recipient, their turnout rate is lower than T1.
Yeah.
Does it mean that more information can confuse people and it's bad for
Yeah, I mean, it could be. It's very smally. Very smally. I love it today. It's only something like, so we have a 1% and that's a 0.9% or something at the end of the day. It's not statistically different at all. So I wouldn't count on it being lower in that sense. But it could be that you overflooded information. Right now it is that they got the same number of messages because we're trying to keep the messages constant, right? I don't want some people to get 20 and some people to get 5. But the first ones had much more mobilization because you had more room to do it over 6 messages. So it might also be just, if I tell you something 6 times and it's the same thing, you go do it. But in the T2, we gave them 6 different bits of information, right? Yeah.
The information that they were getting through text messages, was this in the context of many other media, like billboards and TV and
Yeah.
whatever, or it was kind of the only way by which many people are
So
working?
largely no billboards, lots of media, but lots of people are not, there's some watching TV, but not everybody has TV because they don't have power. We actually have that in our survey, so we can look at whether you were more likely to also then watch events. There were presidential debates. We have that data. On texting, there's no other texting because in the 2007 election, there was a bunch of texting that was pretty negative that went out when the violence started. And so what the Communications Commission in the country said was that during election period from sort of 4 or 5 months before till after the election, no one was allowed to mass text without going to them. So if a political party wanted to send a text to lots of people, they had to go through the Communications Commission, right? This is partly the reason we work for the IBCs. We didn't have to do that because the Electoral Commission had approval from the other regulator to do this. But largely, so there was very little of that. There were small ones, so some people reported, yeah, I was told to go vote for this guy, right? But in our, what do the messages have? That's, I think we got that 7 times in 7,000 or something, right? So it's very small where I emailed a few people or texted a few people around me or something to go vote for me or, something like that. but largely not on text because of this regulation that they didn't want negative stuff on text in case anything happened.
Campaigns on other media like.
So there was campaigns. The biggest campaign that they do is actually not on TV as much as they do these things called road shows, where they, you know, load up a bus and paint the bus, and the bus is the color of the party, and then they go out. And so there's lots of those road shows. So we can look at whether people who had more or less road shows, you know, were affected more or less. Maybe the guys who didn't see a road show were affected. And we have that in the data, so we can look at that. But yeah, that's largely the way of information, campaign information is usually the politicians themselves going out on a bus and doing a show. Yeah. Yeah.
In 2007, there was, as you pointed out, a lot of violence afterwards. And it was just a little bit after the last one. What things were done that you think were the really major factors in avoiding the violence in the last one? Was it a better registration process? Was there more confidence that there weren't a lot of double countings or extra countings or all those kinds of things? Or
that's a great question.
What changed enough to?
I can't tell you exactly what changed. I do think that having a Supreme Court mattered a lot. Having a Supreme Court mattered. And like our Supreme Court justice, now people think he's unfair because of the outcome, right? I don't agree with the outcome, therefore he's unfair. But ex ante, people loved him, right? People were saying he needs to run for president, right? Like, if someone asked me before the election, what's your biggest worry? And I was like, my biggest worry is someone's going to actually try to assassinate him because he's so popular. He was seen as extremely clean, incorruptible, right? Very kind of, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I'm going to do the right thing. So there was his deputy. You know, we've had a lot of terrorism in Kenya, and so a lot of malls put up these metal detectors. And so his deputy showed up at a mall and refused to go through the metal detector. And the cop said, look, everybody does. I know. She goes, don't you know who I am? And he said, yes, I do, but you know, my job is to make everybody go through the metal detector. And she pulls out a gun and threatens him, okay? You know, so I'm Kenyan, so for all of us, we're just like, yeah, whatever, okay, you know? And he fired her. He did a review and she got fired. And everybody's like, sorry, what? You did what? Which it was absolutely the right thing to do, but no one would have. So things like this bought him a lot of credibility and popularity. And I think when the politicians who opposed it decided to go to the Supreme Court, everybody said, okay, let the Supreme Court decide, and we will agree with what the Supreme Court decides. Now, the problem is after the decision, a bunch of people are like, no, he's rigged. They paid him. He must have been paid, right? But I think having ex ante this Supreme Court that people felt was fair and judicious and having a very strong personality, not strong personality, but a well-respected personality at the head of it, I think mattered, right? No, it might not, because you know, this is the problem with institutions. You can create good institutions, but if people perceive it afterwards to have been unfair, whether it was or not, it's done. And politics adds to that, right? The guy who lost is going to always say, like, you know, I met his advisor, and his advisor goes, they rigged it. And I'm like, how? Like, someone explained to me how exactly, right? And they don't have a how. But there is, and they're going to keep saying the same thing. So I think, you know, it's easy to get institutions, but you have to really think about how do we build credibility and information about that institution and distribute it, right? And that's the trickier part of all of this.
Is the Supreme Court appointed or elected at the moment?
Appointed. And actually, you know what, usually the reason he got appointed was they kept fighting. So it was the joint government from 2007. And so it was technically appointed by the president, but there's now 2 heads of state because of this weird election. So they kept shooting each other's candidate down for a while, and then they both picked him, and nobody knew anything about him. And they're like, okay, fine. We don't know anything about him. He's not my guy. He's not your guy. And that's how he could have got elected as like the guy nobody hated. No one side hated, right? Because he wasn't of either of the tribes, and of the big tribes, and he's a big tribe, but not those 2 guys. And so, you know, he kind of got appointed also by mistake. And I think they both regretted it, given how popular he got. They really regretted it, right? But it was one of these where they kept shooting down each other's candidates. They're like, we're never going to get one ever because you can't agree. Yeah.
Okay. How is texting generally used, like socially, over in Kenya? Is it very different from here? Is it a special thing to send a text, or are people just using it all the time? Or?
So it used to be the most popular way of communicating when phones started, because phone calls were actually expensive. So a phone call a minute was something like 40 US cents. 30, 40 US cents. So no one was calling, people would text, because a text was, 1/6, 1/7 of that. So largely people started with texting because of the cost difference. The other thing that you created with phone calls being so expensive was there's a hierarchy of who calls who, because you only pay to call, you don't pay to receive, unlike the US. So most other countries are you pay when you actually dial. And so, if you're like with my field teams, they would send me a text saying, call me. And then I would call them so that I paid for the phone call, not them, right? Or they would call me and hang up. So I think texting was more popular than phone calls because of the price difference. And then basically, there's been huge amounts of competition in the phone industry. And now it's about the same price as a phone call. And so now they've shifted into lots more calls because it's so cheap to call. But it was really a large part of the phone communication. And like I said, with mobile money, what happens is it's all SMS based. So whenever I do a transaction on mobile money, I get a text. And so again, the texting was just a large part of how you orchestrate those transactions. So it's a much more common thing than probably here. Yeah. Okay, last one. Yes?
There's no email.
No, so people do have email in the cities, but largely the only internet is the USB stick you connect up and you dial through the mobile network. So you need to have that USB stick, right? There's a cable that came underwater that reached the coast of East Africa maybe, I want to say two summers ago, maybe 3 even. But they haven't laid the cable in the country yet. So the advantage of that is really not there yet. So you need a USB stick and you need to put credit on it to dial up. So in rural areas, hardly anybody uses email or the internet at all. But in urban areas, you'll get people with email. Again, not with computers, but through cafes. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks so much for questions. I'm happy to take more afterwards or take any comments. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.